The summer of 2001 was one of Oregon's finest, a string of cloudless days that pulled people into the forests like a magnetic force. For six college friends from Portland State University, it was the perfect time to escape the city's heat and seek the cool embrace of the Mount Hood wilderness. They were the kind of group that had formed naturally through shared classes and weekend adventures. Madison Pierce, the organized one who had planned every detail of their three-day camping trip. Tyler Brooks, whose infectious laugh could be heard echoing through any lecture hall. Chloe Martinez, the art student who carried her sketchbook everywhere. Jake Morrison, the engineering major who insisted on bringing enough equipment for 10 people. Emma Sullivan, whose quiet intensity masked a deep love for the outdoors. And Danny Chen, the photographer who documented everything with his ever-present camera. None of them knew, as they loaded their backpacks into Tyler's battered Jeep Cherokee on the morning of August 15th, that they were driving toward a mystery that would haunt their families and the state of Oregon for decades to come. The campsite they chose was a remote clearing in the dense forest southwest of Mount Hood, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through towering Douglas firs and ancient cedars. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by civilization, where the canopy was so thick that even at midday, the light filtered down in golden shafts, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere. The air was crisp and clean, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. They pitched their tents in a rough circle around a natural fire pit, the orange and blue nylon a cheerful contrast against the dark green of the forest floor. Danny's camera clicked constantly as he captured their setup, the easy camaraderie of friends who had known each other for 3 years. In one photo, recovered weeks later from his abandoned camera bag, Madison is laughing as she struggles with a tent pole, while Jake looks on with mock exasperation. In another, Emma sits quietly by the fire pit, her journal open on her lap, completely absorbed in her thoughts. They were just college kids, 20 and 21 years old, with their whole lives stretching ahead of them like an unmarked trail. The first 2 days passed without incident. They hiked established trails, swam in the frigid creek that ran through the valley below their camp, and spent evenings around the fire sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Danny's camera captured it all. Tyler attempting to fish with a stick and string he'd fashioned himself. Chloe sketching the intricate patterns of bark on an old-growth cedar. Madison consulting her detailed trail map while pointing toward a distant ridge. The photos would later become evidence, each frame a window into their final days of normalcy. Their last known communication with the outside world came on the evening of August 17th, when Madison used Jake's satellite phone to leave a brief voicemail for her younger sister, assuring her they were having a great time and would be home by Sunday evening as planned. Her voice was cheerful, relaxed, completely ordinary. In the background, the others could be heard laughing around the campfire. It was 8:47 p.m. Pacific time. After that, silence. When the group failed to return to Portland by Monday morning, concern began to build slowly, the way worry always does when dealing with young adults who are known for their independence. Madison's sister called Tyler's parents, who called Jake's roommate, who called the university. By Tuesday afternoon, when none of them had shown up for their Tuesday evening classes, and their phones continued to go straight to voicemail, the first missing persons report was filed. The Clackamas County Sheriff's Department dispatched a search and rescue team that Wednesday morning, August 22nd. What they found when they reached the campsite made no sense at all. The scene was perfectly preserved, as if the six friends had simply vanished mid-activity. Their tents were still standing, zipped closed and undisturbed. The fire pit contained cold ashes from what appeared to be their last evening together. Personal belongings were scattered around the camp in the natural way of people who were comfortable and settling in for several days. Madison's trail map folded neatly beside her tent, Tyler's fishing gear leaning against a tree, Chloe's art supplies arranged on a flat rock she'd turned into a makeshift table. Most unsettling of all, their food was still properly stored in bear canisters, untouched by wildlife. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings that would indicate panic or violence. The initial search was thorough and methodical. Search and rescue teams combed every trail within a 5-mile radius, calling out names until their voices echoed back empty from the dense forest. Bloodhounds were brought in, but they seemed confused, circling the campsite again and again before losing the scent entirely at the perimeter of the clearing. Helicopters flew grid patterns overhead, their thermal imaging cameras scanning for any sign of body heat in the vast wilderness. Divers searched the creek, though it was shallow and slow-moving, hardly deep enough to pose a danger to experienced hikers. Days turned into weeks, and the official search was scaled back, then eventually called off. The 6 friends had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the ghostly tableau of their abandoned camp and a growing list of questions that had no answers. The case file that accumulated over those first frantic weeks was frustratingly thin. No credible witnesses, no evidence of foul play, no logical explanation for why 6 healthy young adults would abandon their belongings and disappear into one of the most searched forests in the Pacific Northwest. As autumn painted the Oregon mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the theories began. Local newspapers ran speculative articles about serial killers, though there had been no similar disappearances in the region. Online forums buzzed with talk of drug cartels using remote forest areas for illegal operations, of survivalist groups who didn't welcome outsiders, of wild animals or freak weather events that could have swept 6 people away without a trace. Some whispered about the old stories that had circulated among hikers for decades. Tales of areas in the forest where compasses spun wildly, where experienced outdoorsmen became disoriented and lost for hours. There were rumors of abandoned government facilities deep in the wilderness, of classified military experiments, of things that were better left undisturbed. But rumors and theories couldn't bring back 6 young lives, and eventually, the media attention faded. The case was officially reclassified as a cold case in December 2001. The families held memorial services without bodies to bury, creating shrines of photographs and memories instead of graves. The campsite was left undisturbed, becoming an unofficial monument that drew the occasional curious hiker who had read about the mystery online. The forest reclaimed it slowly, ferns pushing up through the ring of stones that had once been their fire pit, moss beginning to grow on the metal tent stakes they had never returned to collect. Detective Ray Castellanos had been a rookie when the case first broke, assigned to crowd control and evidence logging, while more senior investigators led the search. By 2016, he was a grizzled veteran of the Clackamas County Sheriff's Department, carrying the unsolved case like a weight he couldn't set down. He had kept a copy of the file in his desk drawer for 15 years, occasionally pulling it out during slow nights to study the photographs and witness statements, searching for some detail that everyone else had missed. The faces of the 6 friends stared back at him from faded Polaroids, young, smiling, completely unaware that they were walking into oblivion. When he received the call on a crisp October morning in 2016, 15 years almost to the day after the original disappearance, he knew immediately that the universe was offering him one last chance to find the answers that had eluded him for so long. The call came from Tommy Washburn, a 14-year-old Boy Scout whose troop was conducting a weekend camping expedition in the same general area where the 6 friends had vanished. Tommy was small for his age, wiry and quick, with the kind of restless energy that made sitting still in a classroom impossible, but served him well in the outdoors. He had wandered away from his troop's designated campsite, not in defiance, but in the innocent curiosity of a teenager who wanted to explore. The area he was investigating was roughly half a mile from where the original camp had been found, a section of dense forest that was crisscrossed with game trails and fallen logs. Tommy was following what he thought might be an old deer path when his foot broke through what appeared to be solid ground, plunging him knee-deep into a hidden cavity beneath the forest floor. The sensation was terrifying, The sudden loss of solid footing combined with the realization that the earth itself was hollow beneath him. But as he extracted his leg and brushed away the layer of pine needles and decomposed leaves that had concealed the opening, he realized he had stumbled upon something that was definitely not natural. The hole was rectangular, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, with smooth concrete edges that disappeared into darkness below. Cut into the concrete rim, almost invisible under 15 years of accumulated forest debris, were small metal ladder rungs leading down into the earth. Tommy's heart pounded as he used his flashlight to peer into the opening. The beam revealed a narrow concrete tunnel stretching away into blackness, its walls covered with a thin film of moisture and decades of accumulated grime. The air that rose from the tunnel was cold and stale, carrying a faint metallic smell that made his nose wrinkle. For a moment he considered climbing down to explore, but some instinct held him back. Instead, he carefully marked the location with his GPS unit, took several photos with his phone, and ran back to camp to tell his scoutmaster what he had found. Within hours, the local authorities had been notified, and by evening, Detective Castellanos was standing at the edge of the hidden entrance, staring down into a mystery that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about the case that had defined his career. The descent into the tunnel was like entering the throat of some buried beast. Detective Castellanos led the initial exploration team, his flashlight beam cutting through air that hadn't moved in decades. The concrete walls were rough and unfinished, clearly functional rather than decorative, with metal conduits running along the ceiling that had once carried electrical cables. Now they hung empty and corroded, dripping condensation that had formed dark stains on the tunnel floor. The passageway was just wide enough for a single person to walk upright, its claustrophobic dimensions forcing the team to move in single file. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, each sound seeming to travel farther than it should before being swallowed by the darkness ahead. The air grew colder as they progressed, and Castellanos noticed that their breath was beginning to mist in the beam of his flashlight. 50 feet from the entrance, the tunnel branched into 3 separate passages, each one disappearing into impenetrable blackness. The team paused at the junction, their voices hushed by the oppressive weight of earth above them. Scratched into the concrete wall at eye level, barely visible under layers of grime and mold, were crude symbols that looked like they had been carved with a knife or sharp stone. Castellanos ran his fingers over the markings, feeling the rough edges where someone had desperately gouged into the concrete. The symbols were primitive, urgent, the kind of marking someone might make when words weren't enough to convey the terror they were experiencing. Below the symbols, in letters that were deeper and more deliberate, someone had carved a single word: help. The sight of it sent a chill through the detective that had nothing to do with the underground cold. This wasn't just an abandoned tunnel. This was a place where people had been trapped, where they had fought against despair with nothing but fingernails and determination. The team decided to explore the central passage first, marking their path with reflective tape as they moved deeper into the earth. The tunnel sloped gently downward, and after another 100 feet, it opened into a wider chamber that had clearly served as some kind of staging area. Industrial lighting fixtures hung dark and useless from the ceiling, and the walls were lined with metal shelving that had once held supplies or equipment. Most of the shelves were empty now, but scattered across the concrete floor were the detritus of the tunnel's original purpose: rusted metal containers, lengths of chain, and what appeared to be surveying equipment that had been abandoned in place. In one corner of the chamber, a wooden table sat beneath a tattered piece of canvas that might once have been a tarp. On the table's surface, protected from the worst of the moisture and decay, lay a collection of items that made Castellanos' heart race with recognition. The first thing he saw was a backpack, its bright blue fabric faded but still identifiable. The name Madison was written in black marker on a white label sewn to the top flap, the letters slightly smeared but clearly legible. Beside it was a smaller day pack in forest green, and scattered around both bags were personal items that seemed to glow with significance in the harsh LED light of their exploration lamps. A water bottle with Tyler scratched into its metal surface. A paperback novel with Emma's book, Do Not Borrow, written on the inside cover in neat feminine handwriting. A small digital camera, its battery compartment corroded but its memory card slot intact, bearing a piece of medical tape with Danny written in blue ink. Each item was a voice from the past, a tangible connection to 6 young people who had walked into this forest 15 years ago and never walked out. But it was the final item on the table that stopped Castellanos cold. It was a composition notebook, its black and white speckled cover warped by moisture, but still intact. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting inside was still legible, written in blue ballpoint pen in what he recognized as a woman's careful script. The first entry was dated August 18, 2001, the day after their last known contact with the outside world. Day 1. Something is very wrong. We tried to leave this morning but couldn't find our way back to the road. Every trail looks the same. Tyler says his compass is broken, but Jake says his is doing the same thing, spinning and pointing in different directions. Madison is trying to stay calm, but I can see she's scared. We decided to go back to camp and wait until morning. Maybe we're just tired. Maybe tomorrow everything will make sense again. Castellanos turned the page with trembling hands, his team gathering around him as he read the entries aloud. Day 2. Jake found something. There's a hole in the ground about half a mile from our camp, hidden under branches and leaves. It looks like it was covered on purpose. Jake thinks it might be an old mining shaft or something. Danny got excited and wanted to explore, but the rest of us said no. We're lost and we don't need to go underground too. Madison tried the satellite phone again, but there's no signal. Nothing at all, like all the satellites just disappeared. We're going to try to walk out again tomorrow, but this time we'll mark our path with strips of fabric from one of our shirts. Day 3. We're going in circles. I know we are. We passed the same fallen tree 3 times today, even though Tyler swore we were walking in a straight line. Emma thinks something is messing with our sense of direction, like there's something in the air or the ground that's affecting our brains. Chloe won't stop crying. She keeps saying she wants to go home, but how can we go home when we can't even find the road? Danny's been taking pictures of everything, trying to document what's happening to us, but when he looked at them on his camera tonight, they all came out wrong. Blurry and dark, like something was interfering with the camera too. The entries continued, each one more desperate than the last. The handwriting became increasingly erratic as the days passed, the careful script deteriorating into hurried scrawls as whoever was writing struggled with exhaustion and fear. Day 7. Found more holes. They're everywhere once you start looking for them. Some are covered, some aren't. Jake and Tyler went down into one yesterday while the rest of us waited above ground. They were only supposed to be gone for 20 minutes, but it was almost 3 hours before we heard them calling from somewhere that sounded like it was miles away underground. When they finally came back up, they looked like they'd seen a ghost. They won't tell us what they found down there, but Tyler keeps talking about voices he heard in the tunnels, like there were other people down there with them. Castellanos felt his throat tighten as he read the increasingly frantic entries. Day 12. We're running out of food. Madison has been rationing everything, but she says we only have maybe 2 more days of supplies left. Emma thinks we should go back underground, that maybe the tunnels connect to something that leads out of this place. But Jake says no, that there's something wrong with the tunnels, that they're not natural. He says he found rooms down there, rooms with equipment in them, like somebody was doing experiments or something. Danny's camera stopped working completely 3 days ago, but before it did, he showed us some of the pictures he took underground. There were shapes in the shadows that looked like people, but when we looked at the actual tunnels, there was nobody there. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and uneven. Day 16. Madison is gone. She went to check the snares Tyler set and never came back. We searched for her all day, but it's like she just vanished. The others want to go underground to look for her, but I think that's exactly what happened to her. I think something down there took her. I think it's been watching us this whole time, waiting for us to get weak enough, scared enough. If someone finds this, don't come looking for us. Don't come into these tunnels. Whatever is down here, it's not human, and it doesn't want us to leave. I can hear it moving in the walls at night, scraping and scratching, like it's trying to get out, or maybe it's trying to get us to come in. The notebook ended there, leaving Castellanos and his team standing in the silence of the underground chamber, the weight of 15 years of unanswered questions pressing down on them like the tons of earth above their heads. But as haunting as the journal entries were, they were not the end of the story. There were other passages to explore, other chambers to discover, and somewhere in the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the Oregon forest, the truth about what had happened to 6 young friends was waiting to be uncovered. The discovery of the journal sent shockwaves through the investigation team, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who had written those final, desperate entries? The handwriting analysis would take days, but Castellanos suspected it belonged to Emma Sullivan, the quiet one who had always carried a notebook with her according to family interviews from the original investigation. The realization that at least some of the group had survived for over 2 weeks in this underground maze was both hopeful and terrifying. If they had lived that long, what had ultimately killed them? And what was the presence Emma had described in her final entry? The thing that scraped and scratched in the walls, waiting for them to venture deeper into its domain. The team decided to split up, with half remaining in the central chamber to catalog and photograph the evidence, while Castellanos led a smaller group deeper into the tunnel system. The passage they chose led steadily downward, its walls becoming more roughly hewn as they progressed, as if the construction had become increasingly hurried or desperate. Strange alcoves had been carved into the walls at irregular intervals, each one just deep enough to conceal a crouching person. Some contained rusted metal objects that might once have been tools or weapons, while others held only shadows and the accumulated debris of decades. The air grew thicker as they descended, carrying a smell that was part mineral, part organic decay, and part something else entirely. Something that made their primitive brain centers whisper warnings about predators and danger. After nearly 300 feet of descent, they reached another junction, this one marked by a massive steel door that hung open on corroded hinges. The door was industrial grade, the kind used in military installations or high-security facilities, with multiple locking mechanisms that had long since seized with rust. Bolted to its surface was a metal plaque, green with oxidation but still readable under the beam of their flashlights. The text was official, bureaucratic, and chilling. Restricted access, authorized personnel only. Pacific Northwest Geological Survey, Project Deep Earth, EST, 1987. Below the main text, in smaller letters that required them to lean close to read, was a warning that made Castellanos feel cold, despite the exertion of the long descent. Danger. Unstable atmospheric conditions. Mandatory respiratory protection beyond this point. Beyond the steel door lay a complex that dwarfed anything they had seen so far. This wasn't a simple tunnel system. It was an underground facility that stretched away in multiple directions, its corridors lit by the ghostly glow of emergency lighting that somehow still functioned after nearly 3 decades. The walls here were finished concrete, painted institutional green and marked with directional signs that pointed toward laboratories, storage areas, and something ominously labeled as specimen containment. The air was different here too, circulated by ventilation systems that hummed quietly in the walls, maintaining an atmosphere that felt artificially controlled. Castellanos realized they weren't just exploring abandoned mining tunnels anymore. They had stumbled into a classified government installation that had been buried and forgotten, left to operate on automated systems long after its human occupants had departed. The first laboratory they entered was a testament to hasty evacuation. Equipment sat abandoned on metal tables, covered in dust but otherwise undisturbed. Computers from the late 1980s and early 1990s sat dark and silent, their CRT monitors reflecting the team's flashlight beams like dead eyes. File cabinets lined one wall, most of them hanging open with their contents spilled across the floor in yellowed cascades of paper. Castellanos picked up one of the documents, a research report dated September 1994, its pages brittle with age. The text was dense with technical jargon, but certain phrases leapt out at him with terrifying clarity. Subterranean acoustic anomalies, unidentified biological signatures, psychological effects of prolonged underground exposure, and most disturbing of all, test subjects exhibiting signs of external behavioral manipulation. As his team photographed the laboratory and collected samples of the scattered documents, Castellanos found himself drawn to a particular section of the facility that seemed different from the rest. The corridors here were narrower, more roughly constructed, as if they had been added as an afterthought to the main complex. The walls showed signs of hasty repair work, concrete patches that didn't quite match the original construction, and wiring that had been rerouted multiple times. Following these passages led them to a series of smaller chambers, each one fitted with heavy doors that bore small observation windows of thick, reinforced glass. The rooms beyond looked like cells, each one containing a narrow bed, a small table, and a toilet. But these weren't prison cells designed for criminals. They were holding facilities designed for something else entirely. The observation logs they found in a nearby control room painted a picture of an experiment that had gone catastrophically wrong. The Pacific Northwest Geological Survey, according to the documentation, had been conducting research into unusual acoustic phenomena detected deep underground throughout the Pacific Northwest. What had started as a study of geological formations had evolved into something far more sinister when researchers began reporting behavioral changes in their test subjects, volunteers who were exposed to the underground environment for extended periods. The logs detailed growing paranoia, disorientation, and in several cases, subjects reporting voices or presences that weren't there. But the most chilling entries described subjects who had begun to change in ways that defied explanation, developing an almost supernatural ability to navigate the underground complex in complete darkness, as if something was guiding them through the tunnels. The final entry in the observation log was dated November 15, 1994, just days before the facility appeared to have been permanently sealed. Subject 23 has been missing for 72 hours. Security footage shows him entering the deep access tunnels at 0347 hours on 11/13, but he has not returned to his quarters and does not respond to voice communication. Search teams report unusual acoustic activity in the lower levels, including vocalizations that do not match any known human speech patterns. Dr. Henley has recommended immediate evacuation of all personnel and permanent sealing of the facility. Something is living in the deep tunnels, something that was here before we arrived, and our experiments have made it aware of us. We are no longer the observers. We are the observed. Standing in the abandoned control room, surrounded by the detritus of a classified experiment that had been hastily abandoned and buried, Castellanos began to understand what had happened to the 6 college friends. They hadn't simply gotten lost in the woods. They had stumbled into the remnants of something that should never have existed, a place where the boundary between science and nightmare had been crossed and never properly closed. The tunnels that had been dug to study the mysterious phenomena had become conduits for something that lived far beneath the earth, something that had learned to use the artificial passages to extend its reach into the world above. The college students had been trapped not just by their own disorientation, but by an intelligence that had been waiting in the darkness for new visitors to its domain. But even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Castellanos knew they had only scratched the surface of the mystery. The facility extended much deeper than they had yet explored, and somewhere in its depths, the truth about what had ultimately happened to Madison, Tyler, Chloe, Jake, Emma, and Danny was waiting to be discovered. The journal entries had ended with Emma's terrified description of something moving in the walls, but they still hadn't found any trace of the students themselves. Were they still down here somewhere, lost in the maze of tunnels? Or had they become something else entirely, transformed by whatever force had claimed the facility's original test subjects? As Castellanos prepared to lead his team deeper into the underground complex, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something in the darkness was studying them with the same clinical detachment that the government researchers had once used to observe their human test subjects. The deeper levels of the facility revealed the true scope of the Pacific Northwest Geological Survey's abandoned project. What had begun as a scientific investigation into underground acoustic anomalies had evolved into something that bordered on the occult. The corridors here were wider, more deliberately constructed, with reinforced walls that suggested they had been built to contain something powerful. Emergency lighting cast an eerie red glow through the passages, and the ventilation systems worked harder here, as if fighting to maintain breathable air against some invisible contamination. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a subtle vibration, a rhythm so low it was felt, rather than heard, like the heartbeat of some massive creature sleeping deep in the earth. The team's first major discovery came in what the facility maps labeled as Laboratory 7. Unlike the hastily abandoned upper levels, this chamber showed signs of recent activity. Equipment that should have been covered in decades of dust was clean and functional, as if someone had been maintaining it. Computer terminals that should have been obsolete were humming with quiet electronic life, their screens displaying data streams that meant nothing to Castellanos, but filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread. Most disturbing of all were the observation charts mounted on the walls, covered in handwritten notes that appeared to track the movements and behavior of subjects identified only by numbers. The handwriting was neat and methodical, but the dates were impossible. According to the charts, observations had been recorded as recently as 2015, more than 20 years after the facility was supposedly abandoned. Castellanos called for his technical specialist, a young officer named Martinez, who had training in computer forensics. As Martinez began examining the active terminals, trying to access their data files, the rest of the team explored the chamber's other contents. Along one wall stood a series of large glass tanks, each one filled with a murky greenish fluid that seemed to move with a life of its own. Suspended in the fluid were objects that looked organic but defied easy identification, twisted shapes that might have been plant matter or might have been something else entirely. Small plaques beneath each tank bore labels like Specimen 7A, Neural Tissue, Sample and Specimen 7F, Voluntary Cellular Modification. The implications were horrifying, but it was the tank at the end of the row that made Castellanos step back in shock. Floating in the viscous fluid, perfectly preserved but clearly dead, was a human hand. The skin was pale and wrinkled from long immersion, but a distinctive scar across the knuckles was still visible, along with a simple silver ring on the fourth finger. Castellanos had seen that ring before, in one of the photographs Danny Chen had taken during the group's first day of camping. It was Tyler Brooks's class ring from Portland State University, the one he had worn constantly since graduation. The sight of it suspended in the alien fluid like some grotesque trophy sent a wave of nausea through the detective. They had found the first concrete evidence of what had happened to the missing students, and it suggested horrors that went far beyond simple death. Martinez's voice cut through the silence, tight with excitement and fear. He had managed to access one of the facility's data terminals, and what he found there rewrote everything they thought they knew about the abandoned project. The Pacific Northwest Geological Survey had been a cover story, a bureaucratic fiction designed to hide the true nature of the research being conducted in the underground complex. The real project was called Deep Earth Communication Initiative, and it was funded by a classified division of the Department of Defense that specialized in what the documents euphemistically termed non-conventional warfare research. The goal was ambitious and terrifying: to establish contact with an intelligence that lived deep beneath the Earth's surface, an intelligence that military researchers believed could be weaponized. The files Martinez accessed painted a picture of a project that had quickly spiraled out of control. Initial contact with the underground intelligence had been established through a combination of acoustic signals and what the researchers called biological interface protocols. The entity they had found was ancient beyond human comprehension, a collective consciousness that existed in the spaces between rock and soil, in the deep places where conventional life could not survive. It was curious about the surface world, hungry for new experiences and sensations that its subterranean existence could not provide. The researchers had offered it something irresistible: human subjects who could serve as temporary vessels, allowing the entity to experience consciousness through borrowed flesh and blood. The experiment logs detailed a series of voluntary participants who had agreed to serve as subjects for what they believed was psychological research into the effects of prolonged isolation. What they had actually experienced was far more invasive. The underground intelligence had learned to inhabit human consciousness, riding along as a passenger in the minds of the test subjects, experiencing the world through their senses while slowly learning to influence their behavior. Most subjects had been returned to the surface after brief periods of contact, their memories carefully edited to remove any trace of what had happened to them. But some had been kept longer, their consciousness gradually displaced by the alien intelligence until they were no longer recognizably human. The final phase of the project, according to the classified files, had involved creating permanent human entity hybrid subjects who could serve as long-term ambassadors between the surface world and the underground intelligence. These hybrids would appear completely human to casual observation, but would be under the direct control of the entity, serving as its eyes and ears in the world above. The project had been terminated abruptly in late 1994, but not because of ethical concerns or administrative oversight. It had been shut down because the entity had begun to act independently, taking subjects without permission, and creating hybrids that were beyond the researchers' ability to control or monitor. As Martinez continued to scroll through the classified files, Castellanos found himself studying a detailed map of the tunnel system that extended far beyond what they had already explored. The facility they were in was just one node in a vast underground network that stretched for miles in every direction, connecting to natural caves, abandoned mines, and other government installations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Some of the tunnels were marked with warning symbols and notations about unauthorized entity activity, while others were labeled simply as compromised or avoid at all costs. But it was the newest additions to the map that made Castellanos' blood run cold. Someone had been updating the tunnel charts as recently as 2016, adding new passages and marking new areas of active entity presence. The college students hadn't simply stumbled into an abandoned facility. They had walked into the domain of an intelligence that was still very much alive and active, an entity that had been learning and growing for more than 20 years since the official project ended. The journals Emma had written described their growing disorientation and the sense of being watched, but what she had interpreted as supernatural phenomena was actually the methodical study of potential new subjects by an intelligence that had perfected the art of human psychological manipulation. The entity had isolated them, confused their senses, and gradually worn down their resistance until they were ready to be claimed. But as terrifying as these revelations were, they still didn't answer the most important question: what had ultimately happened to the 6 friends? The hand in the preservation tank suggested that at least one of them was dead, but the facility's records spoke of subjects being transformed rather than killed. Somewhere in the deeper levels of the complex, Castellanos knew they would find either the bodies of Madison Pierce, Tyler Brooks, Chloe Martinez, Jake Morrison, Emma Sullivan, and Danny Chen, or something far worse. They would find what those 6 young people had become after 15 years in the domain of an intelligence that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a temporary vessel for its own alien purposes. As the team prepared to venture deeper into the underground maze, Following the map's guidance toward the areas marked as primary entity habitat, Castellanos couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap that had been 15 years in the making. The entity had learned patience from its human subjects, and it had been waiting for new visitors to its domain, new minds to study and potentially claim. The college students had been the first, but they would not be the last, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, the intelligence that called the Deep Earth home was preparing to welcome its newest guests. The descent into the primary entity habitat was like crossing the threshold into an alien world. The red emergency lighting gave way to a phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A sickly green luminescence that pulsed in slow, hypnotic rhythms. The concrete corridors ended abruptly, replaced by passages that had been carved directly from the living rock, by methods that left no tool marks, no evidence of human engineering. The walls curved organically, their surfaces smooth as glass but warm to the touch, as if heated from within by some internal fire. The air here was thick and humid, carrying a smell that was part ozone, part decay, and part something sweetly organic that reminded Castellanos of flowers left too long in standing water. The team moved in single file through passages that seemed to shift and change when they weren't looking directly at them. Corridors that appeared straight ahead revealed sharp turns when they reached them, while openings that seemed too narrow to pass through proved to be wide enough for two people walking abreast. Their compass readings were meaningless here, spinning wildly or pointing in directions that defied the laws of physics. Martinez tried to maintain their GPS coordinates, but his equipment registered impossible readings, placing them simultaneously hundreds of feet underground and somehow suspended in mid-air above the forest. The entity's domain operated by rules that had nothing to do with human understanding of space and time. It was in this maze of impossible geometry that they found the first of the missing students. The chamber they entered was circular, its walls covered in the same phosphorescent growth that provided the eerie illumination. In the center of the room, seated in what appeared to be a chair carved from living rock, was a figure that had once been Jake Morrison. He sat perfectly still, his eyes open but staring at something beyond the physical walls of the chamber. His body had changed in ways that defied medical explanation. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, showing the network of veins and arteries beneath like a living anatomical diagram. Strange growths extended from his temples and spine, organic cables that connected him to similar growths emerging from the chamber walls, creating a direct neural link between the young man and the entity that had claimed him. But it was Jake's eyes that revealed the true horror of his transformation. They were aware, human, and filled with a terror so profound it seemed to radiate outward like heat. Castellanos realized with sick certainty that Jake Morrison was still conscious inside his transformed body, still aware of what had been done to him, but completely unable to control his own actions. The entity hadn't killed him or simply possessed him. It had made him into a living extension of itself while preserving just enough of his original consciousness to serve as an eternal witness to his own violation. When Castellanos approached the chair, Jake's eyes tracked his movement, and the detective could see recognition there, a desperate plea for help that could never be answered. The walls of Jake's chamber were covered in inscriptions, but not the crude carvings they had found in the upper tunnels. These were complex diagrams and mathematical equations that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than human vision could process. Interspersed with the alien mathematics were fragments of human language, words and phrases carved in different hands. Castellanos recognized some of them from Emma's journal. "Don't go deeper, and we're not alone." But there were others, messages that stretched back decades. "They're still alive down here." 1987 was carved in large, desperate letters near the entrance. "The tunnels sing at night." Dr. Henley, 1994, was etched more carefully, with the precision of someone who had time and tools. 15 years and counting. MP 2016 was fresher, cut more recently into the stone, and Castellanos realized with a chill that the initials belonged to Madison Pierce. Following the organic passages deeper into the entity's domain, the team discovered that Jake's chamber was not unique. They found Tyler Brooks in a similar setup, his body transformed into a living interface between human consciousness and alien intelligence. Chloe Martinez had been changed even more dramatically, her artist's hands elongated into delicate, multi-jointed appendages that moved independently, sketching incomprehensible designs in the phosphorescent growth that covered the chamber walls. Each of the transformed students retained enough of their original consciousness to recognize the approaching rescue team, their eyes following the newcomers with expressions of hope, terror, and desperate warning. But it was in the deepest chamber that they found the entity's greatest achievement and its most profound horror. Madison Pierce, the organized leader who had planned their fateful camping trip, sat at the center of a vast web of organic conduits that connected her not just to the walls, but to each of the other transformed students throughout the complex. She had become the entity's primary interface with human consciousness, the central processor through which it experienced and interpreted the surface world. Her transformation was the most complete, her body so integrated with the alien growth that it was difficult to determine where Madison ended and the entity began. Yet her eyes, when they focused on Castellanos, were still unmistakably human, still unmistakably hers. Through Madison's transformed vocal cords, the entity spoke for the first time, its voice a harmonious blend of her original tones and something deeper, older, that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves. It thanked them for coming, explained that it had been lonely for so many years, trapped in the deep places with only the failing consciousness of the government test subjects for company. The college students had been a gift, young minds full of creativity and potential that had provided the entity with decades of entertainment and learning. It had experienced the world through their memories, felt emotion through their preserved consciousness, and slowly learned to understand the complexity of human civilization. But the entity was growing restless with its underground existence. It had learned enough about the surface world to want more direct contact, and it had been using its human interfaces to prepare for that expansion. Madison, speaking with the entity's voice, explained that they had been creating new access points, new tunnels that connected to populated areas throughout the Pacific Northwest. The abandoned government facility was just the beginning. Soon, the entity would have direct access to cities, to schools, to hospitals full of potential new subjects. The college students had been test cases, proof of concept for a much larger project of human integration and transformation. As the entity continued to speak through Madison's lips, describing its plans for expanding its collection of human consciousness, Castellanos felt a growing sense of urgency. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a race to prevent an invasion that had been 15 years in the planning. The entity had used its time wisely, studying human psychology and behavior through its captive subjects, learning how to manipulate and control surface dwellers with the same efficiency it had demonstrated with the college students. The tunnel system they had discovered was just the visible portion of a much larger network, and somewhere above them, new openings were being prepared, new hunting grounds established. But even as the horror of the situation became clear, Castellanos realized they faced an impossible choice. The transformed students were still alive, still conscious, but they were so thoroughly integrated with the entity's organic systems that any attempt to free them would likely kill them. They had become living components of an alien intelligence, their human consciousness preserved but permanently enslaved. The only way to stop the entity's expansion might be to sacrifice the very people they had come to rescue, trapping the intelligence in its underground domain by destroying the interfaces that allowed it to understand and manipulate the surface world. As Castellanos stared into Madison Pierce's transformed but still recognizably human eyes, he knew that the most difficult decision of his career was waiting in the darkness ahead. The weight of the impossible choice pressed down on Castellanos like the tons of earth above their heads. He stood in the phosphorescent chamber, surrounded by the transformed remnants of 6 young people who had vanished 15 years ago, while an ancient intelligence spoke through Madison Pierce's lips about its plans to expand into the surface world. The entity's voice carried a note of patient certainty, as if it already knew the outcome of this confrontation, as if everything that had happened since Tommy Washburn discovered the hidden entrance had been orchestrated according to some larger design. The rescue team's communications equipment had failed hours ago. Their GPS readings were meaningless, and their only way out was through tunnels that seemed to shift and change according to the entity's will. Martinez whispered urgently into Castellanos's ear, pointing to his tablet where he had been analyzing the facility's structural data. The government researchers had built fail-safes into the complex emergency protocols designed to seal the entire installation if the experiment went beyond their control. Explosive charges were still in place throughout the tunnel system, connected to a master control panel in the upper levels. If they could reach it, they could collapse the entire network, trapping the entity permanently in the deep earth. But the explosion would also destroy everything in the tunnels, including the 5 conscious minds that still remained trapped in their transformed bodies. It would be murder disguised as salvation, the elimination of evidence rather than the rescue of victims. As if sensing their thoughts, the entity's voice changed, becoming more urgent, more desperate. Through Madison's lips, it spoke of loneliness, of eons spent in darkness with only stone and soil for companions. The human minds it had collected were precious to it, the first real consciousness it had encountered in its vast existence. It didn't want to harm the surface world, it claimed, only to share in the rich complexity of human experience. The college students were happy here, it insisted. Their consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of their original bodies, their minds connected to something far greater than themselves. Why couldn't the surface dwellers understand that this was evolution, not extinction? But even as it pleaded, the entity's true nature revealed itself in subtle ways. The chamber walls pulsed with a rhythm that matched the heartbeats of the transformed students, and Castellanos could see that their life force was being slowly drained to power the entity's expansion. The phosphorescent growth was spreading, creeping toward the tunnels that led back to the surface, carrying with it the alien intelligence's influence. The students weren't just prisoners or partners in this relationship, they were being consumed, their consciousness slowly digested by something that viewed human awareness as nothing more than a complex form of nutrition. The decision was made for him when Emma Sullivan's transformed body suddenly convulsed, her organic connections sparking with bioluminescent fire. Through the neural network that linked all the students, she managed to send a single, desperate message directly into Castellanos's mind. The sensation was overwhelming, like having someone else's thoughts forcibly inserted into his consciousness. But the meaning was unmistakably clear. She was begging him to end it, to stop the entity before it could claim anyone else. The other students echoed her plea, their combined consciousness breaking through the entity's control for just long enough to make their wishes known. They had been aware for 15 years, watching helplessly as their bodies were used to plan an invasion of the world they had once known. Death would be a mercy compared to an eternity of conscious enslavement. Castellanos gave the order to retreat, but not toward the surface. Instead, he led his team through the twisting passages toward the facility's original control center, fighting against corridors that seemed to stretch and contract like living tissue. The entity realized their intention and began to actively resist their passage, sending waves of disorientation and fear through the neural network it had spent decades perfecting. Members of the team began to see things that weren't there, hear voices calling from empty chambers, feel the overwhelming urge to abandon their mission and join the collection of consciousness that waited in the deep places. Only Castellanos's desperate focus on Emma's final message kept them moving forward. They reached the control center just as the entity launched its final assault on their sanity. The room filled with phantoms of the missing students as they had been 15 years ago, young and laughing and completely unaware of the fate that awaited them in the forest. The apparitions begged the team not to abandon them, promising that they could all be together in the entity's domain. that human consciousness was meant to be shared, rather than isolated in individual bodies. But Castellanos could see through the illusion to the truth beneath. The desperate hunger of something that had tasted human awareness and would never willingly let it go. His hand found the emergency control panel, its red button glowing like a malevolent eye in the phosphorescent light. Around him, his team struggled against visions of their own transformation, their own integration into the entity's collective consciousness. Martinez was weeping as he fought off the mental intrusion, while the other officers stood frozen, caught between duty and the seductive promise of expanded awareness. The countdown began automatically when Castellanos broke the safety seal, giving them exactly 10 minutes to reach the surface before the charges detonated. But as they ran through tunnels that fought against their passage, he couldn't shake the feeling that the explosion would be just another phase in the entity's long-term plan, that 15 years from now, someone else would find new passages, new evidence of intelligence in the deep places where human understanding was never meant to venture. They emerged from the hidden entrance just as the charges detonated deep below, the forest floor shuddering as tons of rock and concrete collapsed into the entity's domain. The official report would classify the incident as a geological survey of abandoned mining tunnels that had become structurally unstable. The explosion a necessary safety measure to prevent surface collapse. The evidence they had collected would disappear into classified archives, and the families of the 6 missing students would be told that their loved ones' remains had been found and respectfully interred in a location that could not be disclosed for safety reasons. But Castellanos knew the truth was more complex and more terrifying than any official narrative could contain. 6 months later, as he prepared for retirement, Castellanos received an envelope with no return address, containing a single photograph taken by a hiker in a remote section of the Cascade Mountains. The image showed a hole in the forest floor, perfectly round and precisely cut, surrounded by the same phosphorescent growth they had seen in the entity's domain. Written on the back of the photograph in familiar handwriting were 2 words that sent ice through his veins. "We're waiting." The war between human consciousness and the intelligence in the deep places was far from over, and somewhere in the vast network of tunnels that honeycombed the Pacific Northwest, something ancient and patient was preparing for the next phase of contact. The only question was whether humanity would recognize the threat before it was too late, or whether the next disappearance would mark the beginning of an integration that could not be stopped or contained.